Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the collaboration album between Short Fuze and Uncommon NASA called Autonomy music. But let's talk a little bit about cosigns first, because as a critic, I'm always pretty wary of them. You get plenty of artists who will pitch themselves as being like a specific act, or being loosely affiliated with them, or for that one guest verse that was super tight that one time to build a bridge of association that they'd never be able to hold again under tighter scrutiny. I tend to be a fair bit more forgiving when the act that I like outright endorses them, but again, I've always got a bit of skepticism. Sure, maybe this producer I really liked helped co-write or add verses to a project and he believes in its artistic intentions, or he's trying to give a friend a leg up and use his status to elevate somebody who's not quite ready for prime time. And yet, my skepticism was sorely tested when Uncommon NASA reached out to me about this project. Given how much I absolutely loved his last album Halfway last year, I was pretty damn optimistic when he said that he contributed both verses and all the production to Chicago MC Short Fuze, who worked with NASA back in 2010 for his debut album Autonomy music, and showed up for a pretty good guest verse on Halfway. And from what I know of Uncommon NASA, he isn't about to co-sign or work with artists that he wouldn't fully support. So I had some faith that this project could really hit home for me, especially as it was just under 35 minutes, a sort of ruthlessly tight project that left no room for error. So I made sure to dig into Autonomy music. Did it stick the landing and meet expectations? Well, in a way it did, because I definitely like this project a lot. The sort of well-framed but slightly off-kilter album that I would expect from these guys. And yet, I can't say I quite like it as much as I liked Halfway. Now don't get me wrong, it's definitely solid with the brand of complicated lyricism and askew production that you might initially disorient you until you dig into it, and yet it's also one of those projects that might be a little bit too scattershot and overstuffed for its own good, with a sort of density that doesn't quite reflect cohesion so much as many ideas fighting for a lot of space. Oh, if you dig in deep to decode this album, there is a framework around these ideas, there is some thematic cohesion, but if I was looking for an album that could have used more time and more room to breathe, it would probably be this album. Now granted, a big part of that is Short Fuze and Uncommon NASA themselves. At first listen, they've got kind of similar flows in terms of the way that their bars are constructed, not so much spoken word, but free-flowing thoughts that coast over unconventional rhyme patterns that definitely have an acquired taste, but one I do like. And both Uncommon NASA and the sole guest star Curly Castro acquit themselves pretty well on their verses with more immediately expressive tones, mostly thanks to NASA's slightly higher register and Castro's thicker rasp. Short Fuze himself, his voice is authoritative, and I respect how his content is more introspective here, but I'm not always certain he conveys the emotive range as well as he could, and he can come across as a little bit monotone, like on Oddest Future. Or take The Darkest Place I've Ever Been, a song that literally focuses on coming to the brink of suicide, and while I understand depression wouldn't quite lead to an incredibly expressive delivery, it still feels a tad flat there, especially in contrast with the other rappers. Now granted, it's not like Uncommon NASA is giving Short Fuze easy beats to ride against, especially with as intricate and unconventional as these flows are. Much of the sample-heavy production is as noisy and dense as the rhyme patterns, including two sampled interludes that shows Uncommon NASA still has an uncanny knack for finding some poignant moments to further crystallize the themes. And like with Halfway, there are a few production choices that don't quite connect with me. The warping whir of squealing, glitchy samples that seems to layer over a dense, roiling beat, and what might sound like a piano underneath The Darkest Place I've Ever Been, the buzzy synth that sprays over parts of the tapping beat, fuzzy blurs of melody, and textured, slightly askew production on time and space, the operatic vocal touches against the scratching of Oddest Future. This feels like a weird blend of styles that doesn't quite mesh with the overlong hook, or the low, oily tune beneath the rattling bass and thicker cymbals on Beggar's Buffet that builds into a blur of strings and heavier echo on the vocals of the hook that didn't quite work for me. And again, I don't think that any of these production choices are bad per se. If you dig into the textures and instrumental, you'll find real melody on these songs and potent hooks. But again, this is material where it's going to take a lot of time to really appreciate. It's not nearly as immediate or hard-hitting as some of the other hooks are here. And the thing is that these hooks are no less complicated in their instrumentation. The keening layers of electric guitar that loop against the noisy drums and trudging beat on Breakdance for the Deaf, the heavier bass line against the scratchier cymbals that play off twinkling swells, and a higher horn line that falls into the textured cushion of scratching and new samples on Perfect Health, the low synth against the stalking bass line, sparse percussion, thin horns, and what sounds like seagulls echoing across the mix that build to a rattling faded elegance on Self-Distortion, a vibe that later repeats on the horns, boom bap beat, and low male backing vocals on Addicted to the Horn, all which further impresses that strong sense of New York atmosphere that's always permeated Uncommon NASA's production. And you know what, it's tough to pinpoint why those production choices work more for me in comparison to consistent with the others. Maybe he's just simply giving the songs a little bit more room to breathe, or a stylistic experiment that clicks a little bit better for me. But I think it's more because the intricate production augments the complex flows and ideas, not obscures or muddies them or competes with them. And make no mistake, there's a lot going on in this album, even if on the surface the theme is well established pretty early on. Art is used as a way to ensure autonomy in modern life, the freedom to make one's own path, something you want to celebrate in society. And yet this album starts on a pretty bleak note, as it begins with uncertainty and depression, not having that clear path until you're hitting your lowest point, which allows this album to truly click into recovery mode less than 5 minutes in. Bit of a wonky way to open up an album. Normally you would expect low points like this one to occur later on, but this album isn't so much delving into Short Fuze's personal anxieties creating this album so much as a focus on his relationship with the art itself, in an industry set against denying a hungry public any sort of hope or deeper content of release through just so much more regurgitated product. And what I like about both Short Fuse and Uncommon NASA, hip-hop goes beyond just pure lyricism but into graffiti and other forms of art that tie into the culture beneath it that can transcend class and social divides. Although they also don't shy away from how that art focus can have its own dangers. Perfect Health, great example. A song that partially focuses on graffiti and gang tags and how hip-hop managed to save Short Fuse's life in the long term, but it opens up with a sample of someone describing how the paint fumes ultimately landed that person in the hospital, and how he'd traded it all back now for perfect health. Self-Distortion goes even darker, showing how Short Fuse's struggle with his faith have left him even further astray, with hip-hop culture and a broken society around him exacerbating it, something the violence of Curly Castro's verse only further emphasizes. And yet, it's one of the reasons I really like the interlude Electric Blanket Conversation, a moment where the person rejects the electric blanket for cutting him off from the cold at night and his compassion, you know, confronting reality. And as this album continues, you can tell that Short Fuse is battling between his introspective impulses to further explore himself through art and isolate further, an addictive compulsion, one he even calls out and highlights on Addicted to the Horn, both in the content and the samples that I really liked, and to make a larger mission. Now, if I were to criticize some of the content, it would come in that larger mission and message on Oddest Future, which goes into social commentary flogging the mass media with a paranoid edge that's probably not as well framed as it could be, especially with lines about the New World Order and going against the mass media, to Occupy Wall Street is the new form of torture. I mean, I get the subtext, I get the darker paranoid framing as part of the point, which is even called out in the final track Beggar's Buffet, and further highlighting how Short Fuse's worst moments that he then channels and deals with through his art, kind of analogous to what Aesop Rock did this year on Molecules off of The Impossible Kid, but it doesn't quite hit with the same impact for me. Misses that additional step to really take it deeper, as the writing doesn't quite feel as focused, especially on that song. This album could have definitely used a slightly stronger ending to tie everything all together. But really, that's nitpicking about details on an album that really does come together well, and like with any other Uncommon NASA affiliated project, reveals more details to appreciate with every single listen. And make no mistake, this is an album that definitely demands a lot of repeated listens, and has only gotten better in my eyes. I'm still a little bit on the fence whether or not I would say it was a truly great album. Again, I think it's a shade weaker than Halfway in terms of focus and impact for me, but it has grown on me significantly over the dozen plus times I've gone through it in detail, and if the most major criticism I have is that it could afford to be expanded so we get more of it, that's a pretty minor complaint. So for me, I'm thinking a very light 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation, especially if you're looking for some more thoughtful, dense New York hip-hop to balance out against the West Coast explosion this year. And Short Fuse? Yeah, this is definitely what I like to see in a return to form, so definitely keep this up. I can't wait to hear more. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll up here, so what'd you guys think about this? You think it was a little bit too dense and cluttered for its own good, a little bit too impregnable? Or do you manage to think it connects with you on a deeper level? Because I think there's a lot here, and it only gets better every single time I hear it. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.